Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura B Floss Tube. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. This is going to be our final video in the Dutch Chocolate Quilt Sew Along series. So I probably will do an update on a floss tube or something after the quilt is quilted, but I'm not going to do a video of the quilting or the finishing for that because I have that. I have videos covering that in my other sew alongs. So if you need help on binding or quilting ideas, you can check those out for those tips and tricks. But we are going to finish up our Dutch chocolate quilt. Now in the last video you saw, I got the entire quilt center put together and it was up on the design wall and it was gorgeous. So all I have to do is that outer border, and then I am going to go ahead and cut my binding strips and get those sewn together. So I do have a couple tips and tricks on that too. So without further ado, let's do some math and let's talk about these outer borders.
So one of the things that I get asked quite often is how to figure out those outer borders. And obviously you want to take your quilt top and you want to fold it in half both ways. And you want to measure 3 points down your quilt. So if you have a quilt like this, and you measure on this edge and in the center, you want to do the same thing on those 3 points as well. And if you do that, then you take the measurements and then you average them out. So I've done that, and so I know that, and actually it worked out perfectly because with my block sizes, I knew about what it should be, and I am actually spot on, so I'm really happy about that. So I know I need 2 borders at 76.5 inches, and I am doing a 6.5 inch border width. So the other direction, I'm going to have 2 more borders at 88.5. But I thought I would give you a little quilting math so you can think through quilts, so you kind of know what size of borders you should be going for, just in case you're interested to see how off your sewing might be. So we had 4 18-inch blocks across our quilt. So when you think about that, on the quilt, on the blocks that are on the edges, those would be 17.75 because you lose a quarter inch on that one seam, and then the 2 in the center would be 17.5. So you have 2 at 17.75 and 2 at 17.5, and then we had our sashing, which was 2.5 inch, but then once you take those seam allowances out, you have 2, and you have 3 of those. So once you add all of these up, you get 76.5 inches. Now, on the other borders, we are adding a 6.5 inch border, but again, we lose half an inch. So you take that 76.5 and you add in your 6.5 times 2, which is 13. So you have 89.5, but then you lose half an inch on the bottom and half an inch on the top. So you subtract that inch out and you have 88.5. So now I have cut my fabric, I have sewn my border lengths together, and I just need to trim those down. Now I've mentioned in a different video that I work in a smaller space, so I have to be creative sometimes on how I cut my borders to make sure that it's going to work on my cutting mat and on my cutting table. So I'm going to show you on the borders how I cut these to the lengths that I needed, and then I'm just going to go briefly over pinning them on and sewing them on. I'm probably going to speed up the sewing part just because I'm pretty sure you can figure that out on your own.
Alright, so I've cut my 6.5 inch borders and they are sewn together. My fabric was about 44 inches wide, something like that, but it doesn't really matter at this point. I just knew I needed 2 borders at 76.5, so I knew I needed 2 width of fabric pieces. I typically cut my borders with a fabric unless the pattern calls for length of fabric, which some of them do, but I just don't do that often just because width of fabric is quick and easy to do. Alright, I thought I'd show a little different angle this time. I'm going to swing you down in just a minute. I basically have my border pieces cut and they are sewn together. So I have 2 width of fabric strips sewn together. And I'm going to lay them on my cutting mat, do a little math so I know where I'm cutting, and then cut these 2 side borders first. Okay, so the first 2 borders I'm going to cut are for the sides, and they need to be 76.5 inches long. And my cutting mat is 24 inches long, so that's kind of a problem, right? So they are folded in half. And I have a 24-inch ruler extending out. So basically what I've done to come up with these measurements, 76.5 divided by 2 is 38 and a quarter. And then I
I think about my cutting mat, and it's 24 inches long. So I know I need to have at least another 15 inches out this way. Typically, I don't like having to cut right on the edge of my cutting mat. I like to be able to cut a couple inches in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my ruler is extended out enough so I can do that. So I need another, I'm going to go 16 1/4 inches out. And I'm basically just going to slide my ruler down, and I'm going to line it up on all the little grids on my cutting mat. And that's 16 1/4, and I'm going to put the seams of that border right on the edge of the ruler. So 1/4 inch is hanging over and down here because that's where the seam is at. So that's what will make that 16 1/4. So 16 1/4 of the 38 1/4 would give me another 22 inches needed. So now I can just take my ruler and my rotary cutter and cut it at the 22 mark. So those are my side borders, and I'm going to set those to the side and grab the top and bottom. Okay, so the top and bottom borders, I actually needed more than 2 widths of fabric. So what I did was I took another width of fabric, cut it in half, sewed it on as well, and then I folded those borders in half, and I took them to the ironing board and made a nice sharp crease. This is going to help me when I'm cutting because now I don't have to wonder if I actually have the exact center or if I am off. So for these, the top and bottom borders are going to be 88 1/2, and that's like we did the math earlier, that's at 76 1/2 plus the outer border that we're adding to it. So this one I'm going to need at least 20 1/4 to use the full length of my mat, but remember I want to use a little less than that. So I'm going to extend this ruler out 22 1/4. And again, I will line it up right on the grid lines on my ruler to make sure everything is nice and straight. And I will take the 2 little folded edges, or pressed edges actually, of my borders. Take them all the way out to the end of that ruler. And I have actually put them around the ruler before too, but I'm not going to do that this time. So they're laying right on the edge of that ruler, and I'm going to give them a good little smoothing out. And again, I've extended my ruler out 20 and 22 1/4 out, so I can cut this at the 2 inch mark. All right, so this is extra fabric. It's 6 1/2 inches wide. I'll probably cut that into 5 inch squares and put it in a bag that I have a bunch of 5 inch squares in for those quick, easy projects someday. Now these borders, this is the top and bottom border. They will go on last. So I'm going to set those to the side. I'm going to grab the quilt center and the side borders and start pinning those on. All right, now again, I have 4 blocks wide, and my table is not as wide as the quilt. So I'm going to have to kind of improvise a little bit on how to do this. I know that I have 4 blocks, and so I know that the sashing is the middle of the quilt. And I could fold the whole thing, but I'm not going to. So I'm just going to take this and finger press that just a little bit, making a little mark there, because that is going to be where the middle of my border goes. So now I'm going to take my border, do right sides together, of course. And I'm going to pin it right in the middle first. I'm going to slide this over. Then I'm going to pin this end of the border to the corner of the quilt. And then I'm going to give it a nice little pop. And you should see that it lays down pretty nicely on its own, but obviously you want to add a few little pins just to kind of keep that in place along the way. And however many you feel comfortable with, I don't know, I do 3 or 4. And then I'll move this over and do the same process for the other side. Of course, the center is already pinned, so I'm just pinning to this other corner, top corner, bottom corner, whatever. It doesn't really matter so much on this quilt because the quilt is square and it is the same. There's, you know, there's no pattern, there's no right or wrong, there's no up or down. Kind of like square quilts that don't have a right or wrong direction. All right, so now this border is pinned on. Now I'm confident in my pinning, so I'm just going to grab this edge and I'm going to take the quilt top, flip it around, and do the same thing for the other side. So. All right, we have our borders pinned on, so we're over at the sewing machine. On these outer borders, these it doesn't really matter as much, but I always like doing a little back stitch out on my outer borders just to make sure they stay in place and stay tight. That's more for the long arming than the actual quilt top construction, but I've just found that if I do a little back stitch on those outer borders, it makes the long arming quilting process go a lot better for me. So I mentioned that I like doing a back stitch on my outer borders, but the other thing I do is if I'm piecing border with the fabric, I will also do a back stitch on those, because that way when you're going down the quilt, this won't come apart. And that's why I mentioned that I like doing that because of long arming. When I put this on the long arm machine, you have your quilt in there pretty taut, and it's kind of pulling a little bit, and if you have loose seams on those outer edges, sometimes they come undone a little bit if you're not careful. So I have just started to where I like to do a few little back stitches on anything that's on that outer border or that outer edge of the quilt. If I have a quilt that's pieced the entire outer length of the quilt, then I will run like a stay stitch around it, about somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch all the way around the entire perimeter of the quilt, just to make sure none of those outside seams come loose or undone when I put it on the long arm. So now I'm just going to take this back over, I'm going to pin on the top and bottom borders and sew those on, and then we'll have our reveal. Okay, so obviously the quilt is bigger than my design wall, but that's okay. It can kind of make it work, right? So I pinned it up there just so you can see what the final result is going to be like, and I have those outer borders on. So it is ready for quilting. The last thing that I'm going to do today is I'm going to cut my binding strips. So my future self will be very happy with my past self. So what I've done is I know that the perimeter of the quilt is 88 inches basically on each side. So that's basically 360 inches. So I need 9 width of fabrics plus 1 more just for good measure. So I need 10 width of fabrics to make sure that I can make it all the way around the perimeter of the quilt when I do my binding. So I'm going to be cutting 2.5 inch strips. And I'm actually going to do a kind of a scrappy binding. It's controlled scrappy because I'm going to use the 3 focus fabrics from my quilt to cut my 2.5 inch strips. So then I will have 10 of those to cut out, and then I'll sew the ends together, and then I'll throw those into this little bin that I keep all my binding in. And then after I get the quilt quilted, all I got to do is pull out that binding strip and sew it on. Now, like I said, I'm going to do a controlled scrappy binding for this quilt. So I'm using the 3 focus fabrics. So I have the black and the gold and the green, and I have them stacked in order. And then I also have 1 extra black just to make up for that little bit that I'll be losing when I'm doing my mitered ends, and just to get all the way around the perimeter of the quilt.
So the last thing I'm going to show you today is just how I'm going to join all of these ends together and save myself a little time with the sewing machine, just in case you've done scrappy binding before and it's a trick to get it organized until you figure out a process. So I'm going to share mine.
Like I said, we have 10 strips here for our scrappy binding. And I just wanted to show you what I do to do my binding. Now this, sometimes, I'm going to be honest, sometimes I just do straight edges and I just go for it. But on this one, because of all the half square triangles, because of all the other angles, I feel like these definitely need to also have angled joins. So I'm going to take this first strip in my stack. I'm going to leave the rest of these together just the way they are. Take the first strip and just do a 45-degree angle join. So it's going on top, the next strip is on the bottom, and that's the only thing that I really need to keep in mind as I'm going through the stack. If I don't keep that in mind, then my angles won't be the same all the way around the quilt, which, you know, that isn't the end of the world, but I'd prefer they be the same. And now, like I said, the black strip was the first one and it's on top. So now the gold one will be on top. This is when having the seam guide tape on your sewing machine is really helpful, because I can just follow this to get those angles correct. And again, the green was the last one I sewed, so it's the one that's going on top. Now, another thing that I do occasionally is I will kind of cheat it a little bit. To make sure I have that angle really good, you can overlap and just leave maybe 1/8 of an inch on each end here, and that way you have a really good, easy place to follow along. I actually love doing that, because then I don't have to peek and figure out where something is overlapping, where it's coming together. It makes it a lot easier for following on my seam guide tape. I'm just going to work my way through the rest of the stack, and then I will cut it and fold it and put it away.
That's pretty much all I have for you guys on the Dutch Chocolate Quilt Sew Along. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you sewed along. If you did, please make sure that you comment below. Let me know how your quilt turned out. If you're on social media, make sure you tag me. You can find my Instagram handle in the description box below. It's Laura B. Flosstube, for those of you that don't want to read the description box below. If you love this quilt, you can find it in the Perfect 10 Quilts book from Fat Quarter Shop, published by It's So Emma. It is one of, I think, 10 quilts in the book. So it's really fun. It was really easy to put together. Go back and look at some of the earlier videos, and I shared just some tips and tricks on ways that I just made it a little quicker for myself because of the controlled scrappiness, that just using 3 colors instead of a complete layer cake. So check that out, and I hope that you had fun with the sew along. I hope you learned something. I hope you picked up a tip or a trick that you hadn't thought of before, and I hope that you tune in again next time. I do have another sew along coming up. I haven't completely decided on which one I'm going to do, but it's narrowed down, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like the video if you liked what you saw. Subscribe to the channel so you know when my videos post, and hit the bell for notifications. If you want to reach out, feel free to find me on Instagram. Again, it's Laura B. Flosstube, or just make a comment down below on this video and I will be sure to get back to you. If you have comments or suggestions or questions, make sure you leave those for me too. I hope you find some time to carve out for creating and crafting, find joy in all you do, and of course, happy stitching.